All right, Raffi, thank you so much again for doing this, man. I appreciate it. I feel like this is a book I wish I had, when I was even graduating from college. But when I saw it, I thought I'd be a fool not to read it even now. So,
I appreciate that. That's exactly the goal.
yeah, totally. Um, you know, I love to also talk about your origin story. I feel like the way you've set up the book makes it easy for someone like me to kind of sort of maybe cherry pick some areas that we can expand on. But if it's okay with you, I'd love to understand, what did your parents do for a living, and how did that maybe impact some of the choices you made in your life?
Both of my parents were immigrants to the United States. So my dad is from France and Israel. My mom is from Chile. And I think a big part of what they strove for when I was growing up was to like provide a better life for their children. I'm Jewish, and so my grandparents fled persecution during the Holocaust. And I feel like there's this mentality that's baked into the, intergenerational Jewish life of like, we're going to do what we can to provide our children with like more safety, more freedom, more prosperity.
Awesome. What would you say, either from either parent, when you think about maybe something you'd like to instill in your kids, a lesson from your parents? What's one that comes to mind?
I think my mom gave me some really good advice when I was relatively young. She said the three most important decisions you make in your life are what you do for work, where you live, and who you marry. And that's actually a framework my wife and I used as we were sort of progressing through each of these. So deciding what we work on, obviously ever evolving, but I feel like we kind of got into that about 5 years ago. Who we married each other about 10 years ago. Where we live was a big decision that we kind of remade a year and a half ago.
Okay. Which I want to talk more about because I think it's a
Yeah.
great personal story. But before we get there, so you taught this class, or are you still teaching the class Adulting 101?
I taught it a while
Oh,
ago. I don't teach anymore because I run a separate organization full time,
okay.
more than full
So,
time.
okay, yeah. So what I was curious about is, how did that come about? I think I read that someone named Amy Donegan maybe hired you to do that, but like, how does that even come about to be a class?
Well, I was hired at Boston College to do career coaching for students and prep them for interviews. So I started my career in management consulting at Bain& Company. A lot of students want to go into management consulting, and there's a specific type of interview they use called a case interview. So I was helping students prepare for that and giving them general career guidance. But similar questions kept popping up in these one-on-one career chats where a lot of the students were frankly lost. Like they didn't know what to do with their skill set. They don't even know if they had a skill set. They were $200,000 in debt. They didn't even know what careers were out there. A lot of them were applying for consulting because they didn't really know what else they could do with their undergraduate business degree. And I was in a similar position, having gone to college previously, like I didn't really know what was out there. And then it spurred these broader questions like, what do I want out of life? Period. What does money mean to me? How do I have better relationships? All these things came out of career chats, but I realized there's this broader need for like, you're about to graduate in 4 months. What do you need to know before entering the real world? And I isolated this list of 14 skills. So it was a 14-week course, 14 skills I wish I had had when I was 20 something that someone could have taught to me, would have set me up to thrive a lot better.
Wow.
So then
Okay.
I ended up creating the course and pitching it. It was approved and I taught it for a few years.
And so I imagine obviously you wrote a book about it, but the response you got was pretty amazing. Were there some like great feedback that you remember from the students?
At first, I honestly wasn't sure who was going to sign up for the class because it was in the undergraduate business school, but it was open to all students. So I ended up getting ones from the education school, the nursing school, the arts and sciences school, everyone. I didn't know, nobody knew about the course. I was a relatively new professor, but it actually filled up within 2 seconds of registration opening. And
Really?
so, yeah, I think there was a huge demand when people realized, like, oh crap, all these things that are listed in the curriculum are things I don't know. I kind of need to know them. So yeah, success wise, it ended up being great because I collected feedback from the students every week. And then I collected it at the end of the course. And then I collected it every year thereafter. So I've been surveying the students. I think I surveyed them for about 3 years after graduation to ask them questions like, what do you still remember from the course? What has been useful in your own life? What do you wish we had covered that we didn't? What did I teach you that might be wrong? But I could collect that feedback, use it to improve the course, use it to improve the book based on that real world data.
Wow. Oh, so was there something surprising you got back, like just something that you recall, like, wow, like
Well,
this?
I asked them how useful
Yeah.
was this course compared to other courses you took in college, and the average rating was like a 9.3 out of 10 or something. Like the vast majority of
Yeah.
people says the most useful class I've ever taken. And this is even including, students who are like nurses who have to learn what they learned and use what they
Yeah.
learned in nursing class.
That's really fascinating. It's so smart to, it's like continue to keep a pulse, because obviously I imagine it informs your book too. That's great.
I know it's relatively innovative, but I'm shocked that not every teacher does this. Like in theory, you care about, are your students learning and is what they're learning useful to them? So I wish for a world where every
Yeah,
professor, every teacher can survey their students and be like, are you actually using what I'm learning in life? And if you're not, like, you should teach something different.
100%. Oh, so I should say the title is How to Be a Grown Up: The 14 Essential Skills You Didn't Know You Needed Until Just
Yes.
Now. Right? Perfect. Yeah. And so, okay. So I think there's a like a foundation I was going back to, and I thought to myself, like, we've got to talk about this. And I think it ranges from what you would call, I don't know if this is material that you pulled from. If you made it up, it sounds really good. But it goes from the impulsive mind to the self-transforming mind, right? The sort of 5 stages of the developed mind. I was curious, what's the significance of that, and like, where do we want to be? Like, where should we be? Where should we strive to live?
Yeah, I did not come up with this. This is actually from a relatively recent field in psychology called adult development.
Okay.
And so the theory goes, just as there's childhood developmental psychology, which studies the different phases children go through, we should also study the phases that adults go through. And so the pioneering researchers in this field came up with roughly 5 stages they think constitute adult development. And the key stage that I taught and try to focus on in the book is the transition from stage 3 to stage 4, called the socialized mind to the self-authored mind. So the socialized mind is a stage that actually most adults are in, according to their research. And it basically means, like, I understand society's expectations. I know how to do long-term thinking, right? Not just be impulsive in the moment, not just care about myself. The self-authored mind, which is the next stage that most adults never reach, is deciding for yourself what you want out of life and pursuing that. Because everyone else is basically living according to what they think other people expect them to do. We've all been programmed. We've been programmed by our parents, our grandparents, our peers, our teachers, society at large, movies we've watched, music we've listened to. All that programming has sort of been subconscious to tell us what should we be pursuing out of life. What is, do we want to pursue money, career, having kids, whatever it is. And a lot of people have never gone through the process of questioning those expectations and saying, do they actually still resonate with me now as an adult? And so when you go through that process, it's kind of like having a quarter life crisis, which I think is a good thing, right? If you don't have a quarter life crisis, you're more likely to have a midlife crisis, because you're going to wake up 20 years after that and realize, I'm living a life that I never chose.
100%. I mean, yeah. I just think back, as I was like reading your book, I just reflect. I think you automatically do on your own experience. And when I went to, even when I went to San Jose State. When I got there was no manual. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. It was in over my head, living an hour from home. Nonetheless, you talk about paying your bills on time and things like, I mean, it's just like, I just wish somebody just gave me this, even like before I started college, or at least when I got out of school. I felt like there was no manual. At least, I think maybe Amazon was in its infancy around that time when I
Yeah.
graduated, right? So it just wasn't as accessible. The information wasn't there.
I think it's still not accessible. I mean, that's why I taught the class. That's why I wrote the book. I think it can
Yeah.
absolutely be useful to students graduating from high school. Basically, the key is, like, when you're in that moment of transition to full independence. And I
Yes.
think, I used to work in education technology, and a lot of research in education technology shows one of the ways to make learning really sticky, meaning to have people actually benefit from what they're learning, remember it, and use it, is if it's at a moment in their life when they can actually put it into practice. And so, although I do think it's a good thing to teach personal finance in high school, we should do more of that. It won't be as sticky as teaching it to someone when they're about to be financially independent and be like, I
Yes.
actually need to know how to do this stuff because I'm doing it tomorrow.
That makes sense. One of the things that I thought was really interesting in the beginning is you have this sort of like Google Doc of your life, right? Like your values and your beliefs, and maybe how you got them, and you sort of reflect, are these because maybe your parents told you, or your parents told you you should have kids, or your sort of upbringing reflected that buying a home is the key to a happy life or whatever. I'm wondering, as you went through that exercise, I think there's something that you call hollow beliefs. And I'd love if you could just expand on that. Was there a hollow belief that you had personally going through this, that you could relate to?
Absolutely. I felt like I was on a path. And so the path took me from high school to Princeton University, then took me to apply for a job at Bain and Company, then took me to apply for an MBA program at Wharton. And it was just like the path of, like, do the most prestigious thing
Yeah.
after. And so when I realized I was on this path, I started to question, like, is it actually beneficial to me at this point in my life? I think there are a lot of benefits that came from going to Princeton, a lot of benefits that came from working at Bain, but going to business school isn't actually something that I wanted to do. It just felt like the thing that other people did. And so at that moment, I actually dropped out of the MBA program 2 weeks before it started. I never showed up. I lost my deposit, but that was kind of the beginning of my quarter life crisis and that journey of reorienting myself towards the things that I thought mattered to me. So the hollow beliefs are the ones that kind of like that achievement mindset I had that were instilled by other people. And if you kind of knock on them, you realize they're empty, they're hollow. It doesn't have anything backing it up other than what people have told me.
Yeah. And so what happened? So you drop out and then you call your mom, or like what like how did you break it to them? What did they say?
I actually did tell my mom on a phone call, and she was really worried. She's like, I think that they might still let you back in if you call them right now and say that you're sorry.
Were you scared to make that phone call? Because I feel like I would dread it.
It definitely was. And part of it is not, I don't think, my parents were going to do anything bad. I think they definitely had my best interest at heart, but I knew that it would be disappointing to them because it's different from the path that they thought would be best for me. Especially my grandparents. I mentioned, my grandparents are survivors of World War II and they were in hiding during the Holocaust. And they had this saying that the only thing you can take with you is your education. Meaning, when you have to flee your country, because the assumption is at some point
Yeah.
as a Jew, you will always have to flee the country at some point. The only thing that will actually matter when you move is your degree, because people will take it seriously and it's what will enable you to, restart your career at a higher point. And I really questioned that. And I was like, I thankfully live in the safest, freest, most prosperous country, possibly in the history of the world. I'm grateful that I don't think I'm ever going to have to flee this country. And so education matters, but there are other things that are more important to me in my career. And I can get a head start on those now. And so it's also telling them about my decision was tough because it was like, I actually want to communicate that I value the advice you've given to me. I think it's great, but I've decided to do differently. And it doesn't mean I'm not grateful for it. I
Yeah.
think to the credit of my parents and grandparents, had a great relationship, but a lot of parents struggle with that of like, my children are living a life that's different from what I expected. It means they're ungrateful for everything that I put into raising them.
Wow. So what did you do next? You decided to, was it like work at a startup, or what was sort of that move for you that you felt like, okay, I'm not going to go to business school. This is what I want to do.
Exactly. It was entrepreneurship.
Okay.
So I took over a startup someone else had founded as kind of like the managing director to kind of run it, get into shape to be ready to fundraise and hire a CEO. And I also started my own company at the same time. And so I basically called it my 2-year MBA experiment, where instead of getting an actual MBA, I would not care as much about earning income. I was only earning equity, but try to learn as much as I could, build a network through doing rather than through school. And the experiment succeeded in the sense that I think I learned a lot. I built a network. I think I learned more than I could have in the MBA program. I didn't make a ton of money, but I didn't lose $200,000. The
Yeah.
experiment failed in the sense that I realized, I was not very good at what I was doing in the end, right? I think there are certain aspects of me that make me a good CEO, certain aspects of me that make me not a great CEO for a startup at that early stage. I tried to fundraise for both of them, and I raised a grand total of $0 and literally ran out of money. And my wife and I had this moment where she was pregnant with our first. She was about to graduate medical school. We were about to move for residency, get a new, more expensive apartment, et cetera. And we had almost $0 in our bank account. And I was like, okay, I think I've given this 2-year experiment all that I can. Now is the moment that I need to change courses.
Wow. Okay. So I might pivot to a few different things because I feel like you're touching on so many things I'm thinking about. One is rejection. You talk about raising money, right? But when you taught this class, when you wrote this book, and you're thinking about why it's important to get comfortable, face rejection, right? And then also, you know, um, how do we also shift from what you call this achievement mindset to this contentment mindset? um you know what do you think about that when you think of like the rejection piece, why it's important to get comfortable facing rejection, and then how do we switch that mindset simultaneously?
Yeah. I think that rejection is obviously very hard. And in the book, I talk about this winter of rejection I faced in college. I was rejected from pretty much everything I tried, including clubs on campus and summer internship opportunities and a girl that I asked out. And it all kind of hit me at once. And I think what I learned through that difficult experience is rejections don't end everything good in your life. Like the world goes
Mm.
on. And so even though they feel emotionally painful, there's no way around that. You can use that to your advantage by developing the superpower, the ultimate superpower, which is being immune to rejection. If you're not afraid of it anymore, then you can try anything. And if you're willing to try anything, obviously your chances of success in whatever you pursue are much greater. That's kind of half the story. The other half of the story is I think that for a lot of people, getting what they want poses an even bigger problem than not getting what they want. Because once they have what they want, the question is, what's next? It's very hard to appreciate now I've got the job, I've got the girl, I've got the career, whatever it is, I've got the house, and to really make the most of it and relish it rather than just moving on to the next thing. So that moving on to the next thing is what I call the achievement mindset, what I was definitely stuck in for most of my life of you reach the top of the mountain, you say, oh, there's another higher peak. I need to start climbing that one. And I think there's a more healthy balance where you can have what I call the contentment mindset. There's nothing wrong with pursuing the next mountain peak. There's nothing wrong with striving for greater impact in your career, as long as you're also pausing to appreciate the moment, appreciate and look down and see how far you've come. And I think the ideal that I aspire to is that I can look forward to what I already have with as much vigor as I look forward to things that I want in the future. So I can put myself back in the shoes of a time where I didn't have everything in my life that I value and be like, wow, I'd be really excited if I could be married to this amazing woman and have this amazing job and so forth. And if I could put myself in those shoes of looking forward to that as if I have it, then when I open my eyes and wake up, I'm like, I do have it. This feels amazing.
It sounds like you've implemented gratitude, right? In terms of having that contentment mindset. Was that, do you feel like that's something that was sort of nurtured along in your life, or is that something like that's hard to do? Like, right? I mean, I feel like we're just sort of trained at a school to your point, the next job, the next thing socially. Was that
Yeah.
something that you learned along the way?
My mom was a great influence on that as well. She cares a lot about gratitude and did her own gratitude journal. I think when I was a kid, I was little, I was kind of dismissive
Yeah.
of it. But as I got older, realized the importance. I think one lesson that was key for me is that something like gratitude, or as I phrase it, contentment, is not a state of being, it's an action, right? It's like you
Mm.
actually have to make it happen. It will not just default to you. I think for a lot of people, their default state is the constant achievement mode or what's next. And so instead, you have to turn it in from something passive into something active.
Okay, that makes sense. I was talking to somebody actually yesterday. He was 21 and he asked me, what advice would you give me? He brought up, I think communication is something important to work on. I said, well, I think something I read recently said critical thinking is actually one of the best skills that you can learn to develop. And when you talk about critical thinking, you talk about something called Sturgeon's Law. I'd love if you don't mind unpacking that for us and the significance of Sturgeon's Law as it applies to critical thinking.
So Sturgeon's law says that 90% of everything you hear or read is bullshit. I think it's actually generous. It's probably closer to 95%. And my aim in when I taught this is not to make people cynical. It's rather to make people skeptical. Because I think that most
Mm.
information you're consuming is either wrong or kind of leads you astray or gives you an incomplete worldview. And it's too easy to just unconsciously assimilate this information all the time because it's coming at you from every direction, especially with the advent of the internet. Everyone who has an opinion is sharing their opinion all the time. You're just constantly inundated with these opinions. They're coming at you. And if you're not taking the time to analyze them and process them, they just become part of your worldview and turn into what we referenced earlier, hollow beliefs, right? Beliefs you have, but you never really examined. And then you realize, like, oh, actually, do I believe this? And so I think that skeptical mindset is different from a cynical mindset. A cynical mindset, you kind of distrust everyone because you think they're badly motivated, like people are out to get you or trying to lie to you or manipulate you or the world is a bad place. I don't think any of that's true. I think most people are well intentioned and trying to tell the truth. It's just not going to give you the whole truth unless you're doing your own piecing together.
That makes sense. On the note of communication, is there something about communication that you feel like even in our 30s or 40s that you feel like we still get wrong?
I think almost everyone gets almost all of it wrong. If we could all get communication right, I mean, the world would just be in total harmony, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I bet the vast majority of problems that we have, ranging from, disputes in a family all the way up to wars, are because of failure to communicate. And so it boggles my mind on this front as well that this is not taught in school. Now, I will cede, of course, some of it is subjective, right? If we had solved communication as a science, things would be a lot easier. It's a lot more fuzzy than that. I do believe, however, there are some fundamental skills that everyone can benefit from when it comes to communication. So a lot of it is fuzzy, a lot of it needs to be figured out, a lot of it's personal, but that rests upon this bedrock of fundamental skills. And those are some of the skills that I try to teach.
What's one of them you feel like, again, even like maybe a little later in life that you see that we can improve?
Assertiveness. I think
Ooh,
assertiveness gets a bad rap because people
tell me about that.
conflate it with aggressiveness, but it's actually very different from aggressiveness. So when you have an assertive mindset, you basically believe I have the right to share my own opinions, and my own needs. And everyone else has the right to ignore them. An aggressive mindset is, I'm going to share my needs and opinions, and everyone else has to go along with them. A passive mindset is, I don't have the right to share my own opinions and needs. And so I think you notice aggressive communicators, obviously you can probably think of examples in your own life that kind of interrupt, they trample over other people, they expect things to go their way. Passive communicators actually have very similar beliefs that other people kind of have to accommodate them, but they don't have the right to speak up. And as a result, they're mostly silent or quiet, and then occasionally have these flare-ups. So assertive communicators are willing to tell you what they think without needing to sugarcoat it or caveat, because they also expect that you will end up doing what you want.
Interesting. Yeah, I imagine with social media or email or however you communicate or choose to communicate something might also impact the way your perceived approach comes,
Tone is
right?
really
Yeah.
hard to get right
Yeah.
in digital means. So email is much harder than in person. Text is even harder than email. Social media posts are even harder than that, right? Because it's just hard to know someone's tone. And so again, that assertiveness can get conflated with aggressiveness. So there's a bit of an art to communicating in written form to be assertive and yet still gentle. Out loud, I think it's a lot easier. I think people can tell from your tone, your body language, you don't expect them to do whatever you want. You're just sharing
Yeah.
what you think.
Okay. Before I forget, so just thinking about what I would call like your career compass, the things that maybe 3 or 4 things that you would use to guide your career. I know like one of them was, you have to be interested in what it is that you're doing next, right? So that was like one of your guiding principles. What would you say were 1 or 2 of the other overarching sort of guiding principles of your career when you had to make big decisions?
Whenever I had to make a big career decision after my first, one of my questions was, is this new job going to help me develop my unique superpowers? So I have this theory that everyone has a set of unique superpowers. And the way to have the most success and impact over the course of your career is to refine them even further. And so superpower might be obvious, right? Like Michael Phelps was obviously born with the superpower of swimming. And it's actually multiple skills in one, right? Like he has the technical ability to move his arms and legs the right way to swim fast. He has a large, wingspan, and he's very naturally big and strong. It's like all these different things put together make him a great swimmer. And so growing up, you might be good at swimming, but you actually realize that you don't have Michael Phelps' arm span. You don't have his appetite to get all those calories every day, but you are very good at teamwork and synchronicity with other people. And you're very good at being attuned to what's going on around you. You realize I'm actually better at synchronized swimming because you have that confluence of skills. And then you could take this even further, be like, well, maybe I'm not as good at the swimming part. I'm good at the diving part. You should do synchronized diving. It's all metaphor for your career, where it may not be obvious. You may not be the Michael Phelps of your job, where it's like obvious, I'm going to be, the CEO of this tech company because I have all those right skills. It's actually hard to figure out what are your unique superpowers and how do they combine to make a job that actually makes sense.
I was going to ask you if you had one piece of advice around um, recognizing your superpower. Like, how do I figure out what it is? If someone asks you that, what do you say to them?
I think there are 3 components. One is it something that you're better at than your peers? Is it something that you care about getting better at? And is it something that actually can make a difference and have an impact? So some superpowers might be sort of mostly useless. But if it's something that you think can actually make a difference on your job in some way, and it fills those other 2 criteria, then it's absolutely worth leaning into and saying, I want to take on more of this work.
Okay. Love that. Okay. What's the best piece of career advice you ever got?
I don't like advice of any kind. I think most advice is not helpful. And the reason is advice is often very suited to the person who's giving it. So, especially when it comes to career advice, they're telling you to do something because they did it and it worked out for them. Or they're telling you not to do something because they didn't do it and it didn't work out for them, rather than walking you through the decision making process that they had. And so, whenever I do like mentoring chats, career chats with other people, that's really what I'm trying to understand. First of all, I'm trying to understand what it is they do and whether they like it and kind of understand their job and their world, because that's interesting. But also I'm trying to understand when they made a big decision, how did they make the decision? Who did they consult? What was the information they had? What did they wish they had known? Did they regret the decision in hindsight? Because that can make you a better decision maker. So in order to be a better decision maker, you can improve that framework and you gather more information. But ultimately, when it comes time to make a decision, I think almost all advice is bad advice if it's saying people telling you do A or do B because they don't have the full picture of you. Only you have the full picture of yourself.
Okay, I've never heard that. I love that. I love that. Be skeptical about any random career advice that you hear. Let me ask you this. Is there a bad piece of career advice that you've heard out there that you feel like people should ignore?
I'm thinking about that one for a moment.
Yeah. I mean, the Scott Galloways will say, don't follow your passion or something like that. There's some stuff like that that's out there that I often hear.
Yeah. I I just hesitate to make these statements about some career advice specifically is bad or others is good because it really depends on the person. Everyone's trying to get something different out of their career. For some
Yeah.
people, what they really want out of their career is stability and income because most of the value of their life comes from elsewhere, right? They're really deep into their religion or their community or their family. And for them, a job is just a job. And that make total sense for their life. And for other people, it might be very different, where it's like so much of what they're getting out of life is coming from their career. And for them, they really need to lean into mission and impact, and salary doesn't matter as much. And so, honestly, I feel like all of this could be good advice, could be bad advice, depending on who the person is. And it really just depends on your own attitude. Any advice you hear could become good advice if you're incorporating it with the right mindset of like, I'm going to be appropriately skeptical of this. Think about what information is this giving me and how can I apply that to my own decision making.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, let's pivot to we'll call it like your living situation compass, right? Because you tell this great personal story in the book. And if you don't mind, I'd love to hear it in your own words. But I think this is important, even for me personally, when I think about we moved to Portland, to a suburb of Portland, Oregon, about 6 years ago, and from the Bay Area. And if you asked me at the time, I would say, oh, I'd move anywhere where we can buy a house, as long as there's not like a natural disaster kind of specific area. Now I would say I'd rather live where there's sunshine and around my friends and family, like support system, right? And so those things have changed. But how did you think about? Tell me about the sort of the big move that you made. It sounds like about a year and a half ago. And what was that sort of compass that you and your wife used to make that decision?
Yeah. My wife and I realized, I guess, we were somewhat happy with where we were living. It was in the Boston area, and we have a lot of little kids. And it was nice for many reasons because we were close to my parents, and I grew up there. And so it was a good place. However, it felt like we weren't really building community. Like a lot of the ties that we had were short term because Boston tends to be a transitory place where people come for like,
Mm,
postdocs or grad school, whatever, and then they move on. And the community just didn't suit us in the specific ways we're looking for. So we basically said we want to do a nationwide search of where is the place that we should live to really start raising our kids. Like our oldest son was about to go into, I think it was first or second grade. And so it's like, he's really going to start school now. Let's pick a school and more broadly, a community, a home, an area where we want our kids to grow up. And so we narrowed it down to certain criteria, right? Some of it was weather. We actually don't care about weather that much. A lot of it was about like, is there a Jewish community in the area? What are the schools like? What are the politics like? Things like that. And we narrowed it down to like our top three. And our top three were Dallas, Austin, and Cleveland. However,
wow. Okay.
we didn't know anyone in Cleveland. We knew a few people in Austin, then my brother and his family in Dallas.
What was it about Cleveland? Because it typically gets a bad rap as a city.
Yeah. I'd say two things that appeal to us. First of all, the Jewish community that's there and Jewish day schools there are a lot more affordable.
Oh, interesting.
And the second was seems more politically heterodox than other places we've lived. Like we tend to be super into politics and also very politically curious. And we'd rather live in a place where that's that kind of heterodoxy of like Republicans and Democrats, people willing to like talk to each other openly
Mm,
about politics.
interesting. Okay.
In the end, we didn't move to any of those places. We moved to a place that I would say was near the bottom of our list based on all those criteria, which is Washington, D.C. And we're extremely happy here. And the reason is we chose to live next door to our best friends. So my best friend from growing up ended up marrying my wife's best friend from her child. So we're like the best friend family couples.
That's funny.
They also have little kids. A lot of their kids are the same age as ours. And we always dreamed of raising our kids side by side. And so we found this unique opportunity of like this new townhome development coming on the market. It felt like 1 in a million the chances that this is happening right now. And even though the house was not in the place we wanted, it wasn't the right house for us in a million different ways. We just said, yes, we're going to do it.
Wow. Okay. That's amazing. To me, it's so fascinating. To your point, general advice can be a bad thing, but it's so interesting for me to learn through your personal experience and like how you sort of made that maybe not perfectly calculated decision, but it sounds like obviously you guys have no regrets and it was maybe one of the best decisions you've ever made.
I think so. And yeah, my takeaway from this for other people is not you should drop everything to live next to your best friends. It might be the right decision for you, it might be the wrong one. It's really more thinking about what is important to you in your day-to-day life. And for me, friendship has always been super important, especially friendship with, this couple that we're very close with. And these broader themes of like raising our kids with other adult figures in their life who they're not related to, I think is really important for many reasons, right? It can teach kids different values and perspectives and having them grow up with other kids next door who they're close with and being a part of the same community as our friends. All these reasons I realize are just super important to my wife and I feeling like we're thriving in our day to day. And all the other scripts that society is giving us about what's most important, like prioritizing where you live based on your job or the weather or economics or something like that actually didn't match what we cared about in life.
How amazing is it to see your kids with your best friend's kids? Just,
Oh, so amazing. It'll be
on
even
a,
more amazing, hopefully, when one day they all get married, but
yeah,
we don't want to force that on
right,
them.
right. Okay. I'm going to pivot to money. What is one piece of money or financial advice you would give your 21-year-old self?
I guess there are two truths that most adults seem to know, but no one ever teaches you, which is A, if you don't save money for retirement, you will likely not have enough to live on when you're retired because Social Security often doesn't provide for everyone's needs. We don't know what's going to happen within the future. You have to save your own money. Truth number two, which is the good news, is you don't have to save as much as you think you do because of the benefit of investing. And investing just means saving money in a way that earns you more money over time. And so, specifically, I think the best way to invest for retirement is to put your money into a low cost index fund that tracks the total stock market and just set it and forget it over the course of 30 or 40 years. And in the book, I go through this in detail and explain why this is true and how it all works, because no one ever taught me investing. No one ever taught me what the stock market is and how it works. And so I really want to start with the basics of like, what is a stock? What does it mean to own a stock? Getting all the way from there to here's what to do with the money for your retirement and why it makes sense for most people.
I love how you also simplified it, and like on the insurance section specifically, because for me, I just remember when I was getting life insurance, like I'm consulting my friends, friends that people trust and maybe they've gone through, but like I just needed like a basic foundational objective thing I could read. And the part I really liked is you would say something like at the end of each section, you would say, um, okay, so is it worth getting? It was like the subtitle, right? And you're like, okay, like this, like, you told me what it is, but like, here's like, it'll help me navigate the decision. So I thought that was really helpful. Is there a financial mistake that you either made or regret that you learned a valuable lesson from when you were younger?
I didn't get a credit card for way too long. And the reason is similarly, my parents, I think they gave me very good financial habits, which is like, don't go into debt. Debt is bad, but they conflated debt with a credit card. And so I only ever had a debit card. And the problem is a debit card doesn't build you credit, it doesn't raise your credit score over the time. And so when my wife and I actually first got married, we did our honeymoon in New Mexico. We got to the airport late at night. The car rental desks were about to close. We were going to rent a car, and they wouldn't let us rent the car because we didn't have a credit score. Neither of us had a credit card
Oh my
and built up
goodness.
credit. And in the end, the story's a happy ending because someone was very nice and let us rent a car, but we had to put a big deposit on our debit card. But I went back home and researched credit cards. It's like, oh my gosh, we need to get a credit card so we can start building credit.
Yeah, I mean, I know you and I may not talk about this section for 30 minutes, but I feel like that section alone, like doing your taxes, financial advice, that's worth the book just by itself, right? Like just read that section, it'll pay
I
for
hope
itself.
so. It boggles
Yeah.
my mind. You have to pay taxes. It is the law. And yet they don't teach it in school. And so I go through the actual form you need to fill out every year to submit your tax return. What is a tax return, first of all? What does it mean? It's different from a tax refund. And then I show a screenshot of every part of the form and what to write in it to help guide people through it.
These are things I feel like I learned the hard way, not at the same time, like year after year, like depending on the life situation. Do I need
Oh, I'm
disability and
still
all those
learning.
things? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know anything. Don't talk to me about car maintenance. I did not include a chapter on cars in the book because I have no idea how to take care of my car.
That was another big decision. I just remember I've had my car and it's paid off, thankfully, knock on wood. But like, I feel like even my siblings will look at the price of a car and they don't sort of put into account the lifetime cost of the car, even the cost of an oil change versus one manufacturer versus the other. So definitely, kind of learning the hard way. But you mentioned something I think is something I think about often. So if somebody asks you, should I use TurboTax or should I go to a CPA? What do you like? What do you say to them? I know you're not going to give the perfect answer here, but what questions might you ask them?
I think it's really valuable to do your taxes yourself at least once. I say yourself in quotes because using TurboTax kind of guides you through it, but you are doing a
Yeah.
lot of it yourself. The benefit is you understand how the system works. And when you understand how the system works, you can actually make financial decisions that optimize for your taxes. So much of your income, and therefore so much of the net worth over the course of your life, is going to get eaten away by taxes. And if you understand how the tax code works, even in a little bit of detail, you'll be able to optimize your habits of income and earning and spending much better. And so I do TurboTax every year because I like to really see everything line by line how it's working. It may get to a point where my situation is too complicated. Now we own a house and so forth that I will pay someone else to do it. It can absolutely be worth paying someone else to do it if your time isn't worth it. But for me, it takes me a few hours to do TurboTax every year, and I learn something new about the tax code every single time. Some of those things I
Wow.
learned about
Okay.
the tax code, I'm happy because I'm like, now I know how to make better financial decisions for next year. Some of those things make me very mad because I'm like, this is so dumb. Why is it like there's a saying that basically half of American law is actually legislated not through laws that come out, but through the tax code, right? The tax code
Ah,
itself, however many pages, like hundreds of thousands of pages, because there's like subsidies for fishermen in Alaska. So they never passed a law saying, let's take money from these people and give it to the fishermen in Alaska. They just added it to the tax code as like a tax, rebate that certain people can get. And there are millions of things like that.
wow. Okay, pivoting. I want to pivot to kids. I'm sure you met a lot of students, even or people you talk to these days. And I feel like this is a little bit of a different generation. Maybe they have kids late, maybe they don't have
Mm-hmm.
kids. But when someone asks you, or if you're just in the middle of a conversation, I'm always curious. Like I ask people, that don't have kids, do they feel like they don't need kids to live a fulfilled life? To me, it's just a fascinating conversation. But what do you typically say to people when they say, "I'm not sure I want to have kids"?
I think it's totally normal to not be sure. It's a major life decision. And as we discussed earlier, there's a ton of peer pressure and societal pressure that can guide you in different directions. So there might be a misconception nowadays that the pressure is to have kids. I think most of the pressure is to not have kids. I think we've gone a little bit more in that direction in society. And so it's actually a little bit countercultural now to say, I do want to have kids. And in fact, I want to have lots of kids. But there's a different right decision for everybody. And my concern is that a lot of people have kids for the wrong reasons. I think it's because it's just the
Hmm.
default thing to do. They want to make their parents happy. They want to make their spouse happy without really wanting it themselves. Or worst of all, they kind of want to create like a person who's just going to love them no matter what and who's going to live a life that they wanted and just foist all their own expectations and live vicariously through that person. It's kind of like giving birth to an indentured servant. Because as soon as they're born, they owe you something. They owe you to make the life decisions that you want them to make, or they owe you the love that you never had from your own parents. And I think that's not a great way to bring someone into the world. And so I try to break down what are the wrong reasons to have kids, and then what could be some of the right reasons. And for the latter, it's hard because it's so subjective, but I share mine. I share the reasons that my wife and I came up with for why we want to have more children.
Makes sense. Okay, fast forward 20 years from now. What would you hope that Judah, Nalita, Dahlia, Gideon, and Carmel say about you as a dad?
Oh, amazing. You got all their names. I think the first thing and most important thing that so much research shows is just the unconditional love, right? Like if you give your kids unconditional love, they're set up for success leaps and bounds above people who are not. And I say success broadly. I don't mean financial, but like just like to have a thriving life. So that probably first and foremost, and maybe is obvious. Beyond that, what I really want to do is raise an adult, not raise a child. Meaning when they get to the point that they leave our house to begin life on their own, being independent, they have a lot of these skills of being able to build their own worldview and their own goals, and then have the knowledge they need to move towards those goals. I think a lot of people try to raise children. And what I mean by that is like follow my rules, follow my values, follow what I want out of life. I think it makes a lot of sense to do that while they're in my house. Like we have rules and we want to enforce the rules and we want to teach them our values and we want to teach them about Judaism and all these other things we want to impart to them. But at the end of the day, I'm not raising an indentured servant. I'm raising an independent person. And when they get to that age, I want them to be able to make their own decisions. Of course, I hope that a lot of those decisions are in line with the values that I have. On average, just based on statistics, they will be, right? Most people share the same religion and politics and so forth as their parents, but it's okay in the grand scheme of things if they don't. And one of the reasons why we're having many kids is to hedge our bets, right? One of them might end up like a total dud, but at least we'll have others.
That's funny. Do you want more?
Yeah.
Okay. I feel like anytime you're at an odd number, you need to get like to, at least 6 or 8 or something. That's amazing.
Well, speaking of cars, when we were buying a minivan, we had to decide, do we want a minivan that seats 5 in the back or 6 in the back? And we had to decide, we had one day to make this decision of, are we going to pay the extra $1,000 for that middle seat in the back to fit a sixth? And at the time, my wife and I decided we only want to have 5 kids. We're like, maybe we want to have 6. So we pay the extra money for the minivan. I feel like now it's locked us into having 6.
Smart. Yeah, that's amazing. Is there one thing that you do as a parent or you and your wife do as parents to help model the independence of the kids that comes to mind?
There's one habit that I'm trying to get into. I did not come up with this. And I will say I'm not a great exemplar because I have to remind myself to get in this habit. But whenever they ask a question, our first instinct is typically to answer the question. But instead, I think it's better to respond, say, what do you think? And I've gotten amazing results because, first of all, it's teaching them critical thinking to think for themselves, but it's just interesting and funny to hear their answers. So people ask me, like, why is the sky blue? Before I go into my scientific explanation, what do you think? And you get the most hilarious responses.
That's funny. I love that. That's a good hack. Um, okay, just curious, what's the best piece of advice you got from your book agent, Jim Levine?
He taught me to consider what value a publisher brings other than the name brand. And
Mm,
so my publisher is Chronicle, which in some ways is a name brand. They're a great publisher, but it's not like Penguin or whatever. And I think it's been amazing to publish with Chronicle because at least 2 things. One is they design beautiful books.
I was gonna
I'm
say they
not
make the nicest books like that. If I just see a lot of covers, and if you were to ask me what's the one thing I remember about Chronicle, it's like the book designs. They're just different.
exactly.
Yeah,
And so much of this book is pedagogical, right? And so it uses a lot of exercises and graphics and pictures and all these different charts and boxes. And so they made those work, right? So people can read them and they look good and they're understandable. The second thing is they have a really great network of distributors that are not just the traditional bookstores and Amazon. They do that as well. Of course, the book will be available in all those places, but they also have this network of independent gift shops, independent bookshops, university bookstores. It's all the places where I think it's going to be the ideal place to buy a book as a gift for someone who's graduating.
makes sense. Um, Most of what I do is around career advice, so I should probably ask you some work advice. One of the things that you said, I think maybe this is one of the most important things in the book when it comes to actually working is you should, I don't know, it sounds funny when I say this out loud, right? But uh, focus on making your manager's life as easy as possible. And you have some descriptive ways to do that. What's one or two pieces of advice you would give around making your manager's life as easy as possible? Maybe you could share why that's important, because I totally agree with you.
Yeah. Well, it's important because a big part of what you're hired to do is to make your boss's life as easy as possible. And so, really, what they're doing is they have a ton of work on their plate. They're hiring you because they need you to take some of it off. And so, ultimately, you're making their work life better because you're doing work that they would have to do themselves otherwise. And so, the more you can engage in that skill of empathy, putting yourself in their shoes, the better you can be as an employee and make them happy. And I'm saying make them happy as a goal, not because purpose of life is to make your boss happy or they should be some godlike figure in your life. It's just because if you want to move up, usually that's one of the best ways. So I'll give 2 examples. One of the examples is instead of saying no, say yes if. I now know as a manager, it's really frustrating when I ask for something and the response is no, because maybe the person's right, they can't do it over, but then I have to reconfigure my whole work plan of who's going to do what, and it's a headache. So instead of saying, no, I can't do this, you could say, yes, I can do this if I drop this other project. Yes, I
Mm.
can make the deadline of sending you this project by tonight, but I'll have to push back this other project till the next day. And so you're always giving the manager a solution. The solution obviously is a trade-off, and ultimately you're letting your manager decide if they want to do the trade-off, but you're coming with a solution instead of just a no. The
Love it.
second tip among many that I give is what I call the cardboard cutout test. So sometimes, often it's good to talk to your manager, ask them lots of questions. Of course, they want to help explain things to you most of the time. But sometimes you get to know them really well, and you don't actually need to go to them to ask a question. You can figure something out for yourself. And so I call it the cardboard cutout test because you can imagine having an actual cardboard cutout of your manager's face on your desk and just talk to it and say, I'm thinking of doing this. What should I do? And oftentimes you'll know exactly what they're going to say to you.
It made me think of just something else. Go to your manager with one or two solutions that you have already thought of versus what do you think about this? Maybe you're talking to the cardboard cutout, but if you are, you're probably, to your point, you're going to come with one or two solutions yourself. And then if you really need to go to your boss, at least you've thought about it intentionally. And I feel like it usually pans out to be a much more productive conversation.
Yeah, when you give them solutions, you're giving them options. You're not giving them a problem, right? If you're like,
Yeah.
what should I do? That now gives them a problem. One more thing they need to figure out. If you give them solutions, say, oh, I get to pick like which of these I think is best. And it's just much easier to make that judgment call.
100%. Um, is there a book or two that's made a big impact on you that you recommend other people read?
Many books. I'll try to narrow it down to two.
Yeah.
Okay, can I do three?
Oh, 100%. I mean, if you have five, I'll take the list.
I'll do three.
Okay.
One of them is The Defining Decade by Meg Jay. In some ways, it was the inspiration for this book because it's geared towards 20 somethings. She's a therapist who almost exclusively works with 20 something year old clients. And so her book is a synthesis of all these therapy appointments she's had, trying to teach people how to set themselves up for success in their 20s. And one of the big conclusions she comes to is it's really helpful to aim in some direction. A lot of people feel lost in their 20s because they haven't figured out their career, their relationships. Very normal, very understandable. But what they're doing is they're kind of swimming in that direction, then this direction, then this that direction. They don't know where to go and they get paralyzed. Instead, just say, pick a direction and go in that direction until you decide it's no longer the right one.
Hmm.
And I found that, I had my students read the book. She came to speak in my class one year. We did a panel in front of the whole senior class. But like students loved this message because it resonated with them so much of like, it's better to pick a direction, aim in it, than to just be aimless. And of course, you can always change directions later, but having one direction to aim in provides you with the clarity you need to like really get going.
I love that. I think that's great advice. I'll definitely check it out.
Second book I love is called Infidel by Ayan Hirsi Ali. Have you heard of that one?
No.
So she grew up in a extremely, I would say, like devastating circumstances. She grew up in, I think it was Somalia and Saudi Arabia, and was suffered female genital mutilation and had an arranged marriage with an abusive husband. Just terrible life circumstances. What I find most inspirational about her story is not only how she got out of it, but how she rewired her worldview. She basically realizes that she grew up indoctrinated, for lack of a better term, in fundamentalism. And when she moved to the West, she moved to Netherlands and taught herself Dutch and started reading the Western canon. And it changed her opinions about almost everything about the world. And I love this story because it's proof that we are not set in stone. We're not fixed. Our views about the world, yes, a lot of it is programmed into us, but we can break free of that programming and think for ourselves. And in her case, it was an extreme example of indoctrination her whole life, then learning a new language just to learn new ideas, and those ideas changing her worldview. If it can happen, that most extreme example, I think it can happen to anyone else, of you can change your mind based on learning new things.
What's her name again? I got the book down, but Ayala?
Ayan Hirsi Ali.
Okay.
This book was so inspirational to me that I actually bought a copy of it for every one of my campers when I led the summer trip one summer. Because I was thinking if there's any book I would have wanted to read at their age, which was like 17, 18, it was that one. So I gave it to every one of them.
Wow. Okay. I love it. What's the third one?
The third one is called Humankind by Rutger Bregman. Have you heard of it?
I feel like I've heard of it, but no, I haven't read it.
He basically debunks a lot of these narratives that were taught in college. If you take like Psychology 101 and learn about the Stanford prison experiment or the Kathy Genovese story, he debunks a lot of anthropology if you learn about like the violent tribes of Easter Island. Because he's saying all these narratives that were taught are like human nature is bad. And by nature, humans are violent, they're apathetic, and so forth. And by debunking these common experiments and historical stories and things like that, he's basically showing actually human nature is not bad. Human nature is pretty good. And of course, it can go wrong in a million different ways. And he goes through the reasons why people can become Nazis and so forth. But for the most part, intrinsic human nature is to try to help other people. And so we can lean into that nature more.
Love it. Okay, great. I appreciate that. All right, Princeton.
I hope I did
you...
these authors justice of their
no,
masterpieces with my crude summaries, but hopefully got people interested enough to check out the books.
They all sound really compelling. I feel like they're books almost anybody could read. I mean, I think that's the other beauty of it is yeah, I mean, you can't get enough of to me. I love also memoirs, just hearing about somebody's life. And if it is, I'm a sucker for audible memoirs as well. Or if like you're reading your book yourself, right? And if I'm interviewing somebody, typically, I love to listen to it because the one thing you mentioned a while ago was tonality is so hard to sort of tell through an email or through a book. And so if someone does have a book they've read that they've written themselves, and if you're interviewing somebody, there's just so many nuggets, right? You could tell by the emotion when they read. So Princeton calls you and they say, we'd like for you to give the commencement speech. I know you're not one to give advice, but if you had to give a message to, a group of students about to graduate that want to make an impact in this world, sort of the truncated version here, what would you tell them?
You've been programmed since an early age to live a certain way. And this is one of the only opportunities you'll get in your life to take the time to question all of your default assumptions about the world and what you want from it. And so you can take advantage of that opportunity and think for yourself about what it is that I want out of my relationships, out of my career, out of my education, out of where I'm going to live in the world. And before you start falling into these decisions, really figure out what your own values and needs are. And then when it comes time to put them into practice, aim in one direction, right? And see where it takes you before you change your mind. And so as you're about to embark on the next phase of your 20s, I think a big part of it is being intentional with your exploration. So you've thought for yourself, decide what you want, you're aiming in that direction. How do you get there? Make intentional experiments. Say, I'm going to take this job because it helps me lean into my superpowers. And I might be wrong about what my superpowers are. I might be wrong that this is a good job. You can always correct that mistake later. But as long as you're making a decision intentionally, instead of just living by default, you'll get much further. And so I guess the ultimate summary of all this is don't live life on default mode, live it on purpose.
I love it. Raffi, is
Okay,
there
would you
anything that
hire
feel
me?
like I'm
Are you in touch with the Princeton dean? Do I get the
No.
do I get the gig?
I work for TED. You're getting a TED talk. 100%. I think it's a great message, man. This is the stuff I love, because one thing I try to do, whoever I interview, is have a conversation through the lens of career advice. And so when I saw your book, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of career advice in there, but to me, that's the stuff that's most exciting, because to me, a lot of it, it's not like, we talked about your compass for moving. Well, that impacts your career tremendously, right? So all these things are sort of blended together. I don't think work and life are completely separate. You've got 5 kids. Somehow I haven't heard any of them in the background. I don't know how you did that, but that's magical. But even before I like even set up like my desk to look presentable for this, I mean, my lighting was all over the place. My kids, the monitor's always like crooked, it's like, there's a fort behind me typically 3 days a week. And so I do think all this stuff is, it's all blended together. And so like, how do we intentionally live a life that we can design and try? And we didn't talk about this, but I loved in the beginning when you said, I think you called it, was it FTV or like
LTF, long-term fulfillment.
LTF? Yeah, optimize for long-term fulfillment. I thought that's a great way to think about it, rather than trying to optimize for happiness, which is, I think, what we're taught, which is maybe why I bought Stumbling Upon Happiness and all these like happiness books at one point in my life. So I think it's one little tweak with how we think about things can make a huge difference in our lives, I feel like.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome. Did we miss anything, or do you feel like we covered good ground here?
I guess, can I share one more thing about the book?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I would frame it this way, where I'm not necessarily out to make a career as an author and sell as many copies as I can to make money. For me, it's really about a mission. My mission is to empower people in their late teens, early 20s with the knowledge they need that will set them up for success later in life. And so I felt like my ability to have an impact by teaching a course was limited, because I only had like 18 students a year. I wanted to keep the course small enough for seminar style discussion. With a book, hopefully I can reach 100, 1,000, a million times that many people. And I just know for myself, if I had read this 15 years ago, I would be in an even better place today. I think that's true for a lot of people. And so the nice thing about this mission is that people can join in on it. Like, you can join me on it. Anyone who's listening can join on it. Either read the book yourself or gift a copy to someone who you think could benefit from it. And so together, what we'll do is change the world we live in from one in which people don't have the life skills that they need to set them up for that long-term fulfillment, into a world where people do have that knowledge.
Well said. I appreciate it. I have a cousin who like is in college, and I felt like, oh, this is the perfect book, or it should be in every bookstore, if those still exist, and university campus. I don't even know.
Yeah.
Do they? Okay. So it should be at the counter,
Exactly.
So I'm sure it'll impact a lot of people. I appreciate you leaning into this. I know I asked you 37 million questions in different ways. So thank you for just being open and leaning into it. I appreciate it.
These were great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.